From absolute and relative surplus value to alienated work, from the crises of superproduction to the neo-colonial, neo-imperialist exploitation of the third world in the global market, from increasingly centralized control of the means of production by the bourgeoisie, from class struggle to the definition of class as a social relation to the means of production, from the destructive use and application of science and technology in the capitalist mode of production, to the forms of political oppression, from Foucault's biopower to the notion of a principle of reality which Herbert Marcuse from the first generation of the School of Frankfurt takes from Freud's psychoanalysis and tries to understand from the standpoint of how society, culture and the political system shapes the historical expression of the principle of reality, all the way to the antagonism between capital and wage labor, and to the competition between capitals where the technologically more developed capitals exploit the technologically less developed capitals in the world market. In the present video, I will show the importance and validity of the theoretical framework of historical materialism, which aims to understand a society's political and cultural organization and configuration in terms of the mode of production, how the development of the forces of production and the antagonism between the development of the forces of production and the social relations to the means of production affect and shape the political and cultural landscape. Understanding politics and culture, as Marx says in Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, as an edifice built upon the base of the economic infrastructure of the mode of production, with the intention of showing the validity of the previously mentioned categories which form the framework of historical materialism. I will begin first with absolute and relative surplus value. One of Marx's most important discoveries in the context of his critique to political economy is the concept of surplus value. Surplus value means value, keeping in mind that there are at least three ways to understand value: exchange value, value of use, and fundamentally value as living work objectified, human life objectified in the value of a commodity or a product that is then commercialized. So, in order to understand surplus value, the value of a commodity must first be understood as objectified human labor, human life that is objectified in the process of production of a particular commodity. Now, surplus value shows that the amount of human life that is objectified in the value of a commodity, which is then measured in money and is given a price in the market, when that commodity is sold, the totality of the value, which is human life objectified, human labor objectified, is not returned in the salary. The salary only returns the means of subsistence. That is, it is the minimum value that the proletariat or the worker requires in order to live, to perpetuate his or her own life. But the salary only gives back a small portion of the totality of the value that is produced by the objectified labor of the worker. The rest of that value, which is the majority of the value of the product, is accumulated in the form of private property by the bourgeoisie when the product or commodity is sold, is commercialized in the market. That means that the value of a commodity, which is human life objectified, is not returned in the salary of the proletariat. And since Marx in chapter 14 of the first volume of Capital distinguishes between absolute and relative surplus value, absolute surplus value means to increase the amount of hours, that is, to increase the number of hours that the worker objectifies his living work, his life, in the process of production of a commodity. And by increasing the number of hours, the number of value is increased. That value which is not returned in the salary. The means of subsistence is equivalent to the salary of the worker. And that salary doesn't change as the number of hours are increased. But since the number of hours are increased and work increases, the value increases, and the amount of surplus value which is not returned in the salary also increases and is then accumulated in the form of private property by the bourgeoisie. Now, surplus value doesn't apply only to physical labor, it also applies to intellectual labor. And as we shall see, surplus value and alienated work still define the structures of exploitation of capitalism, even in the new forms of work which depend more on intellectual production than the physical fabrication of a commodity. They still apply to the proletariat of the factory, of the industrial market, but it also applies to a scientist who no longer physically produces a commodity, but applies his own knowledge and is therefore objectifying his life in the process of applying an intellectual production, that is a theory, into technology. And if that scientist, for example, works in a pharmaceutical industry or in a technological industry, and he or she is not able to innovate, to transform, to create, to change actively that intellectual product, that application of knowledge into technology, that scientist is a victim of alienated work and also surplus value, because even if the salary of some proletariats today is worth more than the means of subsistence, that doesn't take away from the fact that the totality of the value produced, be it from intellectual or physical labor, is not completely returned in the salary. There is still a great difference between the amount of value that is returned in the salary and the value which is not returned in the salary and which the bourgeoisie accumulates in the form of private property when that product, be it physically produced or a commodity that derives from intellectual labor, is commercialized or is sold. Especially in third world countries, where there are many social classes which are not even integrated in the class struggle of capitalism. That is to say, there are many oppressed social classes that are not even proletariats because they don't even have a salary. They are not wage laborers like the peasants, like indigenous groups in Latin America, in Africa, and even in Asia. These oppressed classes are not even proletariats, and yet they suffer even more, because if the proletariat, who is integrated within the framework of social relations in capitalism, suffers surplus value and alienated work, together with the political oppression that responds to the antagonism of the dominant class and the class which is dominated, those who are outside of those social relations suffer even more, because as Marx says, these groups are reduced to non-being, to nothingness, because they're not even integrated in the social relations of capitalism. Now, to summarize what's been said so far, surplus value, absolute and relative, remain valid categories to understand the ways in which exploitation is carried out in today's capitalist mode of production. In addition, we have alienated work, and it is called alienated because as far back as the German ideology, Marx and Engels already show that the essence of the mode of production is to transform matter, nature, in a way as to satisfy certain specific needs that are required in order to perpetuate the life of an individual and the life of a community. Now, if work is not controlled by the workers, that is, if the means of production, be it science, resources, or even the means of cultural, intellectual production, are not controlled by the workers, by the proletariat, if the means of production of that work, be it resources, forces of production associated with industry, or means of production that are associated with the production of knowledge, art, and culture, are controlled by the dominant class, that is, the dominant class has a centralized control of the means of production and of the forces of production, controlling even the development of the forces of production, alienation takes place because, due to surplus value, if the totality of the value which is objectified life is not returned in the salary, and if the majority of the value produced by the life of the worker objectified in the process of production is accumulated in the form of private property by the bourgeoisie, by the capitalist, that value is responding and gratifying the needs of the bourgeoisie, of the dominant class. That is, the means of production and the development of the forces of production due to the application of science and technology responds not to the needs of the majorities, but to the needs of the dominant class, of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist. That is why when a crisis of superproduction takes place, that is, a crisis in which capitalism has so much civilization, as Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto, that they have so much developed the forces of production that it is necessary to destroy old markets and to conquer and create new markets, because economy is momentarily frozen by a crisis of superabundance. That superabundance, that superproduction, obeys the interests of the dominant class. That is why we have programmed obsolescence, in which technological devices are fabricated and purposely designed to fail in a shorter period of time than they could be fabricated to last, purely in order to create cycles of consumption, cycles of irrational production, and maximize profit, maximize capital. That is why science and technology are used, for example, in the industry of medicine, to fabricate medicines not with the interest of curing but of selling. That is why the food industry, instead of solving the problem of world hunger, decides to produce a series of chemically and genetically engineered foods which are damaging to the health of the people who consume them, whilst millions of people in the third world suffer from starvation. This dehumanized and irrational application of science and technology, combined with alienated work, that is, the means of production which are not owned by the proletariat but by the dominant class, and in general a development of the forces of production that respond purely to the interests of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists, allows us to understand the destructive nature of modern day capitalism. Absolute and relative surplus value, which means that the totality of the value, which is objectified life, is not returned in the salary. A crisis of superproduction, where so much is produced, and commodities which cause the crisis of superproduction do not respond to the necessities of the majorities. That is, they are unnecessary commodities, necessary trash, which destroys the environment, which causes health problems, and which causes a whole series of problems in the cultural sphere with the whole entertainment industries, together with the use of science for the war industry, for an industry in which medicine is researched and medicines are produced in order to sell and not to heal and cure diseases, in which the huge development and capacity of the forces of production is wasted in order to maximize gain and profit instead of solving the important issues of today like world hunger, poverty, etc. And finally, the neo-colonial exploitation of third world countries by the technologically more developed capitals of the first world, taking that framework of center-periphery, that is the center, which from the 15th century began the first cycle of accumulation of profit that allowed the Europe of the Western Roman Empire to overcome feudal relations of production and develop the forces of production from the working of the land to manufacture, and finally from the 18th century onwards to the Industrial Revolution. That exploitation in the world market of the less developed capitals, together with all the categories and the concepts that I've explained so far, allow us to show the validity of historical materialism as a method, rigorous and exact, for understanding the capitalist mode of production and in general society and its pathology, society and its contradiction from the standpoint of the economic infrastructure.